It was a cold evening in January of 2023 when I found myself sitting at a round table in a polished Italian restaurant in Dublin, Ohio. The place had that quiet hum of money, the kind where the waiters glide in black shirts and soft shoes, and the menu never lists prices. My daughter Emily had insisted we join her husband Daniel's parents for dinner. She thought it would be good for me to spend more time with the Hales. She said it with that earnest smile of hers, the one that still reminded me of when she was a little girl asking for one more scoop of ice cream. I agreed because I rarely said no to her. Emily sat beside me, Daniel across from her, and his parents Gerald and Diane took the seats at the far end. Gerald wore a tailored blazer that looked a bit too fine for a man who often complained about overdue medical bills. Diane had her hair styled perfectly, pearl earrings catching the light each time she moved her head. I kept my observations to myself, cutting into a piece of bread, sipping the water the waiter had just poured. The conversation began with pleasantries. Diane asked about the weather in Columbus, though it was only a 30-minute drive away. Gerald chuckled about the traffic, claiming his old SUV was giving him trouble again. He sighed heavily, pressing a hand against his chest, as if to emphasize how difficult life had been. Daniel nodded sympathetically, and Emily leaned closer, her eyes filled with concern. I listened, nodding when expected, though inside I felt that familiar pinch in my chest. I had heard stories like these before. Emily often told me Daniel's parents were struggling, that unexpected bills kept piling up. More than once, she had dipped into her own paycheck, sometimes even convincing me to help to cover what she called emergencies. I never questioned her too hard, because Emily was all I had left after her mother passed, and I could not bear to see her upset. Halfway through the meal, Daniel's phone buzzed. He excused himself, and Emily followed a moment later, saying she needed to stretch her legs. That left me alone at the table, with Gerald and Diane, who were now discussing vacation spots they wished they could visit, if only money was not so tight. Gerald chuckled about Hawaii. Diane sighed about Paris, and I felt something twist inside me. That was when the young waiter appeared. He must have been no older than 28, tall, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes that noticed everything. He leaned toward me as he set down another basket of bread, and for just a second, his hand rested firmly on my wrist. It was not rude, but enough to make me pause. He lowered his voice to barely more than a whisper. "Are you Emily's father?" I blinked, unsure whether to answer. My throat tightened, but I gave a small nod. He whispered again, soft enough that Gerald and Diane could not hear. "Be careful. The Hales are not what they say. They are not struggling." Before I could react, he straightened, replaced the bread, and walked away as if nothing had happened. I sat frozen for a moment. My pulse thudded in my ears. I looked down at my hands and forced them to stay steady. When I raised my eyes again, Gerald was swirling his wine glass. Diane was adjusting her pearl earrings. They had not noticed. The words of the waiter clung to me like cold wind. "Be careful, not what they say." When Emily and Daniel returned, both smiling, the conversation picked up again as if nothing had happened. Daniel spoke about his attempts to restart his real estate career. Emily praised his determination, and Diane added another complaint about rising insurance costs. Gerald leaned back in his chair, scanning the menu for dessert. I tried to focus, but my mind kept circling back to the waiter's warning. I studied the Hales more carefully now. Gerald's blazer, the way it fit his shoulders. Diane's manicure, neat and glossy. Daniel's watch, which I knew was not cheap. These were not the markers of people living paycheck to paycheck. When the bill arrived, Gerald pulled a gold credit card from his wallet, without hesitation. He handed it to the waiter with a smile that carried no hint of worry. I watched closely, waiting for a grimace. A hesitation, any flicker of stress that might come from a man struggling under debt. There was nothing. I forced myself to breathe slowly, steadying the storm in my chest. Emily glanced at me, catching my silence, and she gave my arm a gentle squeeze. "Dad, are you all right?" I nodded, but my thoughts were far from calm. The meal ended with laughter and promises of meeting again soon. Gerald offered to host us at their house the following month. Diane kissed Emily on the cheek. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder. I walked out into the night air, the January chill biting through my coat. The waiter's words still echoed in my ears. "Be careful. They are not what they say." I did not speak of it on the drive back to Columbus. Emily hummed softly beside Daniel, content and blind to the storm brewing inside me. I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, my hands clenched in my lap. Something was wrong, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. The road unspooled under the tires, a black ribbon that reflected the scattered streetlights along Route 161. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel. Emily hummed a tune I could not place, her head tilted against the glass. I watched their silhouettes and told myself to be careful with my words. There are things a father can say once and never take back. When the lights of the outer belt came into view, Daniel said he needed to stop for gas. He pulled into a speedway near Morse Road and announced he would run inside for coffee. Emily asked for tea, and he grinned and said he would see what they had. The door shut with a hard click, and the car settled into a stillness that felt almost fragile. I asked my daughters whether she thought Daniel might be helping his parents more than he should. I used the gentlest voice I had. She turned to me. She said Daniel was doing what any decent son would do. She said Gerald had been in and out of appointments at Riverside Methodist, that Diane's prescriptions were expensive, that none of it was anyone's fault. She added that things would settle down once the new listings came through, once the market picked up again. I nodded as if reassurance could be borrowed, but the words did not quiet the scraping inside my chest. I told her I was only asking because I had watched her take on weight that did not belong to her. She said I worry too much, that grief has a way of making small shadows look like storms. I let that sit because I knew what she meant. The store door swung and closed. I kept my voice low. I reminded Emily that she had been generous for a long time. She said generosity is how we were raised. I could not argue with that. I told Emily there is a difference between giving and being emptied. She did not like that. She said Daniel is a good man and a good husband, and he does not take advantage. She said his parents have had a hard year, and it is not right to judge from the outside. She looked toward the store and said Daniel would hate this conversation. I said I was not judging, I was asking. Emily took the tea, gratefully told him I was asking about my blood pressure, and Daniel nodded as if that explained everything. He merged back onto the road, and the silence folded around us again, thicker this time. Memory has a way of stepping out onto the road without looking both ways. I saw the day of their wedding as clearly as if it were playing on the windshield. Daniel made a toast with a plastic flute and promised to take care of my little girl for as long as he lived. He cried when he said it, and I believed every word. I danced with Emily while her mother laughed. The early years brought small requests. A transmission failure, a deposit they could not miss, a surprise medical bill that had to be covered by Friday. Nothing outlandish on its own. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. Emily said they would pay it back once Daniel closed his next sale, and sometimes he did. Then came the month when the rent for Gerald and Diane was due, and a promise had fallen through. I told myself that is what fathers are for. I logged into my thrift savings plan and pulled out a small amount. I swore it would be the only time. 2 years later, I did it again, and that time I told myself it was a bridge just to get them to the other side of a slow season. We crossed the river. Emily let her head rest against the seat and told Daniel that the tea helped. Daniel said he had a second showing on a colonial in Worthington next week. I wanted to believe for her. I wanted it so badly I could taste metal on my tongue. Back in Columbus, Daniel turned down my street and eased to a stop in front of my building. He said he would wait while I went up, but Emily put a hand on his arm and stepped out with me. We walked slowly to the front door and stood beneath the porch light. She asked if I was upset. I told her I was fine, which was our family's way of saying I was anything but. She searched my face again, then said she wished I would give Daniel a little room. She said he is trying. She said I had become suspicious and that I was not like that before. I told her I missed her mother and that missing makes a man cautious. I said caution is not the enemy of love. She said love is not a spreadsheet, and then she asked me not to turn into the kind of dad who Googles everything and then comes to dinner ready to cross-examine. The words were light, but they landed like small stones. I told her I would try to be easier company. She said she loved me. I watched her walk back to the car and tuck herself under Daniel's arm. Inside my apartment, I hung my coat, set my wallet in the dish. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer, where I keep the pension statements and a stack of envelopes I never throw out. I laid a few on the table and read the dates. I tried to add up the years and the favors and the transfers, but the numbers would not hold still. I reached for a pen and started a list in the margin of an old utility bill. September of 2017, $500, to help with a move. March of 2019, a withdrawal for a car repair. July of 2020, an advance for a procedure that never did show up in the mail as a receipt. Be careful, not what they say. I wrote those words in the corner of the paper and drew a box around them. Then I set the pen down. The room was quiet. I could feel that old part of me, the one that wants to trust, rising to argue for everyone I love. I let it speak, and then I let it sit back down. In the living room, I stopped in front of the framed photo of my wife on the bookshelf and told her in a whisper that I would be careful. I did not know what careful meant yet. I only knew that it would not mean more checks written in the dark. In the morning, I made coffee strong enough to bite and stood at the window while the pale gray of January pulled itself over the neighborhood. I washed my mug and set it in the rack, dried my hands on a towel, and told myself to keep my eyes open. I did not have a plan, not yet. I had only attention, and sometimes that is the only tool a man needs. If what the waiter said was true, it would show itself where people are most themselves, in the habits they cannot help. I decided I would stop waiting for hearsay and start looking for what is in plain view. I picked up my keys and thought of the places the Hales liked to be when they were not telling stories about emergencies, country clubs, boutiques. I told myself I would go about my day, run the errands a retired man runs, and keep my eyes open. By June, the heaviness of winter had lifted. I had fallen into the habit of running errands with my eyes open. That morning I turned onto Sawmill Road and caught a glimpse of Gerald in the lane beside me. He was driving an SUV that did not match the story I had been told. The paint was so new it threw the sun back at me. A temporary tag showed a date that would not expire until July. Gerald slid ahead with the confidence of someone who knows where he is going. I kept 2 cars back. He signaled and turned under a stone sign I had driven past 100 times without looking. Dublin Country Club. I did not follow him through the gate. From there, I could see the entrance and most of the circular drop-off. Gerald tapped his horn twice and the guard stepped out as if late to a party. He leaned toward the driver's side and I saw the guard's hand make a familiar gesture, the quick scan of a membership card or a windshield decal. Gerald drove to the portico and stopped where the shade was thickest. A young attendant came jogging out with a valet pad in his hand. I could not hear every word at that distance, but I knew the rhythm. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. The bag today or the cart?" He opened the rear hatch and pulled out a set of golf clubs whose heads gleamed even in the shadow. He held the bag with the casual care of someone used to nice things. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding and watched the scene repeat itself for another member and then another. A pair of men in light polos waved to Gerald, and he returned the wave with 2 fingers and a private smile. I sat still and took in the details that matter when stories do not match. Gerald had told Emily his SUV was failing him, but this one still had that peculiar new car posture. He had complained about prescription costs, yet here he was picking up a bucket of balls from the club pro shop. I did not need to be close to know what color that card probably was. I pressed my palms against my knees until the feeling softened enough that I could think again. The attendant walked the clubs toward a cart with Gerald trailing a step behind. The stocky man clapped Gerald on the shoulder. I could not reconcile that with the sighs and the hand to the chest over dinner, the little speeches about how hard this year had been. My phone sat in the cup holder. I picked it up and waited for the shaky feeling in my hand to pass. I took 2 careful photos, one of the temporary tag, one of the gatehouse with the guard in his slow salute. A minivan pulled into a space near me. I adjusted my mirror so I could see the gate again. If Gerald looked my way, I did not want to be a face he recognized and filed. He did not. I imagined telling Emily what I was looking at. She would say, "Country club does not mean wealth." I turned the phone face down and let the screen go dark. The point today was not to argue. The point was to see. When Gerald rounded back toward the first tee, I caught a glimpse of his face in profile. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself to breathe. I was a father trying to decide whether to keep letting a story pass through his hands like sand. I turned the key, and the old engine in my sedan answered with a familiar rattle. I drove out of the office lot and back to Sawmill, merging into the slow midday stream. From the corner of my eye, I saw the country club sign recede, then the trees, then only sky. I tried to forgive the difference between what she needed me to be and what I was becoming. At a red light near Hard Road, I pulled the car into a right turn lane and parked for a moment. I opened the glove box and took out the notepad where I had scribbled figures the night before. I wrote Dublin Country Club, membership greeting at gate, temporary tag valid through July, new SUV, clubs look top shelf, photos saved. I slid the pad away and closed the latch. He paused in the median and bent to scratch the animal's neck with both hands. I pulled back into traffic and headed toward Henderson Road. I did not feel victorious. I did not even feel certain. I knew what I had seen. I knew that one day soon I would be asked to explain it to someone who did not want to hear. For now, I would keep watching. There would be a lunch invitation. When it came, I would accept, and I would keep my eyes open. July settled over Dublin with a steady sun. I pulled into the Hale driveway at noon and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The house looked freshly scrubbed white trim, bright against pale brick. Emily opened before I could knock her face lit with practiced hospitality. She said she was glad I came and that Diane had been cooking since morning. I stepped into a burst of cool air. The living room was the first thing that spoke. A leather sofa I had never seen before stretched along the far wall. Opposite it hung a television so large it looked like a window into some other house. New soundbar under it. On that table sat a bottle of red with a gold neck and a small badge on the label. Gerald appeared from the hallway. He gripped my hand with seriousness and said we were family here. He asked about my drive and then gave a heavy sigh about hospital invoices. They kept arriving, he said. He mentioned appointment copays and tests. As he spoke, his gaze drifted lovingly over the leather sofa, then to the television where a golf tournament replayed in silence. Diane moved in from the kitchen with the quick steps of a host. At her throat sat a string of pearls. A gift, she said with a smile. An old friend surprised me after church. I nodded. Emily took my arm and guided me toward the dining room. The table was set with chargers and cloth napkins. She whispered that Diane had made roast chicken with lemon and herbs, and that Daniel had brought fresh bread from a bakery in Worthington. Daniel walked in then with 3 loaves. He nodded at me and said, "Dad." I answered with his name and let the word rest between us. We sat. Gerald poured the wine with a flourish. He said we should toast to health and resilience. He said family gets through anything. I sipped the wine and let it sit on my tongue. It was good. Emily smiled at me as if the goodness were hers to share. Daniel buttered bread and told a story about a buyer who ghosted him after 2 showings. He said next month would be better. The fall always brings serious people. Gerald set his glass down and launched into the latest chapter of bad news. He had received a letter from the insurance company that week. A denial for something essential, he said. The debt would follow them for years. He did not know how they would manage. He would never burden anyone, of course. He knew pride was a sin, but he also knew the dignity of a man should be respected. His voice at this part thinned into a practiced gravel. Diane leaned forward. She said a dear friend had helped her with a spa certificate. She laughed softly and said the friend insisted. Stress relief is not indulgence, the friend had said. Emily nodded, absorbing each line. She told me that Daniel had been handling most of the bills and that she tried to do what she could when things got tight. She said this without looking at me. Daniel added a supportive hum and said this year had just been ugly for the Hales. He said they were cutting subscriptions and selling items online. I felt the old pressure climb my ribs, not rage, something quieter and heavier. I took another sip of wine and watched my hand for any tremor. It stayed still. Good. My voice would need steadiness more than volume. Gerald asked about my health. I told him my numbers were fine, that walking every day did what pills would do for another man. He sighed again about prescriptions and the way Diane could not sleep without a certain brand. Emily reached under the table and squeezed my wrist, a small private signal that meant be kind. I patted her hand and did not pull away. She looked relieved. Daniel told a joke about a home inspector who found a squirrel nest in an attic fan, and everyone laughed. When the plates were cleared, Gerald invited us to the living room for coffee and dessert. He handed me a mug. On the television, a commentator mouthed words about a swing path. Diane opened a small velvet box on the coffee table. She said the friend who gifted the pearls wanted her to have the earrings too, but she did not feel right taking both at once. She would wait. Self-restraint, she called it. Emily leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder and said she loved how cozy the house felt. Daniel kissed the top of her hair and said it was because his parents made every place warm. He asked Gerald if the insurance company had responded to the appeal, and Gerald shook his head gravely. He said these processes take time, and in the meantime, the bills do not care. I asked how many appointments Diane had this month. Diane blinked and said 3 or maybe 4, then corrected herself to 2 when Emily began listing dates. Gerald quickly said the numbers shift, and they try not to burden the kids with details. He waved a hand and sipped his coffee. A small silence opened. In that space, I saw the room as a ledger. Assets on the walls, liabilities on the lips. The pearls were entries. The television was an entry. The wine bottle was an entry. The size were entries that did not balance anything. Gerald broke the pause by thanking Emily for her support. He said she had been a blessing during a season of testing. He said not everyone raised children who understood sacrifice. Daniel nodded and added that Emily had a heart like her mother. I held her gaze and smiled the way a father smiles when he wants his daughter to feel safe, and then I looked back at the room. The new leather. The untouched remotes. I thought of the waiter's hand on my wrist, and of the gate guard who waved without asking questions. I thought of the temporary tag on Gerald's SUV, bright as a fresh bandage. Diane rose and brought out a tart. She said a neighbor had shared the recipe and that she finally had the courage to try it. She cut even slices and placed them on plates. She said she hoped it was not too indulgent. Gerald laughed and said, "Life is short." He did not say short for whom. We ate. The tart was perfect. I told Diane so, and she glowed with the satisfaction of someone whose skill has been witnessed. Emily looked happy that I was happy, and for a moment my chest hurt with the ache of wanting that to be enough. Gerald began another story about a billing office that lost a form, then found it, then misplaced it again. He shook his head and said, "Incompetence has a cost." I let him talk. Daniel chimed in with a plan to help his parents refinance something. Emily murmured that she could pitch in if needed. Diane touched the pearls and smiled at me. When the afternoon thinned and the light in the living room tilted toward late, I stood and thanked them for lunch. Emily walked me to the door, her hand looped through my arm. She asked if I had a nice time. I said the food was wonderful and the company was gracious. She said she was glad, and she hoped I saw that her in-laws were doing their best. I told her I saw a family that knows how to host. She kissed my cheek and told me to drive safe. On the porch, I paused and watched my reflection faint in the black screen of the big television behind the glass. Then I stepped into the heat and walked to my car. As I pulled away, I pictured the pearls catching the last of the daylight, the leather smoothing back into place where I had sat, the gold label winking on the bottle in the dining room. Late July settled over Columbus. I was rinsing a coffee mug in the sink when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. The preview showed a single line and a photo. The line read, "From Michael the waiter," and the image opened to a crisp rectangle that filled the screen. 2 glasses of champagne, 2 steaks marked prime ribeye, a side of asparagus with garlic and oil. Service charge already included. Total $480 even. Below the totals, the processor line showed a card brand and 4 digits, and then a name that made my jaw set. Gerald Hale. I dried them on a towel and zoomed the image. The timestamp read last night, Dublin, the same part of town where we had eaten together. Another text followed. Michael wrote that he saw Gerald raise a toast, that there was laughter. He added that he had risked a photo only when he closed the check at the station, and that he would not do more than that. I typed back that he had done enough and to be careful. Then I set the phone down. The ring came mid-afternoon. Emily. She said Daniel had run into a snag with his parents' prescriptions. The pharmacy would not release a refill until a balance was cleared. She said it was not much, and then she said it was more than they had this week, and that they were embarrassed even to mention it. She did not ask me for anything, not directly. I told her I was listening. I asked whether the pharmacy had a program for temporary hardship. She said Daniel was checking, and that things were just tight. She apologized for bringing it up, and then said she would let me know how it shook out. She told me not to worry. I told her I would try. We hung up and I stood in the kitchen with the phone in my hand and the photo of the receipt still burning in my head. I felt one in my chest, then a clean fork where the old way veered left, and the other road said, "Find out what is true." I picked up my keys and stepped into the heat. I drove to Dublin with the windows up. Michael appeared from the back with a bar towel over his shoulder. He nodded toward the side patio where no one was sitting. He told me it had been a lively table. Gerald with two men close to his age. They started with champagne. When the bill came, Gerald produced a gold card and a slim line pen. Michael said he saw the name when he took the check to the station printer, and that the screen flashed it again when he closed the transaction. No photos until the check was signed and the card handed back. He said he could get fired for less. I told him I was not asking for anything more. I thanked him and said he had done the decent thing. We shook hands and I left a tip at the bar that would not raise eyebrows but would be remembered by the right person. Before I got back on the highway, I parked near Bridge Park and walked into a wine shop with framed maps on the walls. I said I was looking for a bottle with a small badge on the label, a producer from Napa, whose name I mispronounced on purpose. He led me to a shelf. He touched one and said, "This one runs $149 before tax." I nodded and thanked him. I did not buy anything. I did not need to. The number was what I came for. Back in the car, I took a photo of the shelf and the price tag, and then another of the shop exterior. I sent none of it to anyone. I drove home with the receipts held tight in my mind. At my kitchen table, I laid a legal pad flat and wrote the date at the top. I drew 2 columns. In the left, I wrote the word claim. In the right, I wrote the word cite. Under claim, I wrote pharmacy will not release refill until balance. Under cite, I wrote dinner receipt 480 with champagne and steaks yesterday. I added Dublin with the time and the name printed. Habit carried me to the filing cabinet, where old statements lived in a neat row. I pulled the folder with the lake house documents and set it aside, then dug out a fresh manila folder and wrote the word Hales across the tab in small block letters. Inside, I placed a printout of the photo, the notes from the wine shop, and a copy of my own withdrawal history for the last year. Around 6, the phone vibrated again. It was Emily asking if I had plans for the weekend. Just small things, I typed. She wrote that Daniel might drive his parents to an appointment on Friday, and that they would probably spend the evening at home. She added a small line that read, "I am glad you came to lunch." They were nervous about making a good impression. I typed back that the food was excellent and left it there. I poured a glass of water and drank half without tasting it. Then I gathered myself and called my neighbor Darren to ask if he would be home later in the week. He said he would, and I told him I might swing by with a question about home tech. He laughed and said questions about home tech were his only religion. Evening bled into the windows, and the apartment cooled to that hour when the noise of the city softens and neighbors turn their televisions down. I set the folder on the desk and clicked on the small lamp my wife had bought at a yard sale 10 summers ago. I wrote another line on the pad. Do not confront Emily yet. Gather facts. Let the facts speak. I underlined the words once. I stepped to the bookshelf and looked at the framed photo of Emily at 12 grinning through a gap in her teeth because she refused braces for 2 years. Behind her, the arch of a park footbridge, red leaves a sky too blue to be believed. She had trusted me then to show up when it rained at the picnic. She still trusted me to show up, even if she no longer trusted my questions. I let the ache come and go like a tide, and then I went back to the table and added one more thing to the list. Call Tom Sanders tomorrow. Ask about documenting financial coercion. Keep it neutral. Keep it quiet. The phone stayed face down for the rest of the night. I washed the dishes by hand and dried them and set them on the rack. I checked the front lock and the slider and the small bolt on the back door, and then turned off the lamps one by one. The manila folder on the desk looked like any other piece of paper in any other room. I knew better. I went to bed without praying for sleep. I have learned that sleep arrives more reliably when it is ignored. I spent the morning watering the boxy little patch of grass behind my building, then carried the empty can around to the front, where the shade sits for an hour before noon. That is where I saw Mrs. Delaney coming down the sidewalk. She lives 2 doors from the Hales and knows the rhythm of that street better than the post office does. She stopped when she saw me and touched my forearm. "Richard," she said, thought you should know what I saw last weekend." She said the Hales threw a birthday party for Gerald on Saturday. A party with rental vans and men in black shirts setting tables on the lawn. She said a catering truck backed up to the driveway, and a pair of cooks in white coats carried in trays. A tent went up by mid-afternoon, and musicians tested microphones. She said she heard music after dark. I listened and did not interrupt. She said she saw boxes with foreign labels near the recycling bins on Sunday morning. She said there were dessert plates stacked in the garage like a small hotel had moved in for the night. She lowered her voice and added that a valet stand had appeared by the curb, 2 young men waving cars into the cul-de-sac, with polite little bows. I asked how many people were there. She said she counted at least 60, maybe more faces she did not know, and a few she did from the club. She said Gerald gave a speech by the tent poles, and Diane cried into a linen napkin, while someone tapped a knife on a glass. She told me all of this without malice. She told me because the last time we spoke I had asked her to tell me if she saw anything that did not match the arithmetic we were given. I thanked her, and she touched my arm again. "Be careful," she said. She walked on toward the bus stop, and I stood a moment with the empty watering can, feeling the absence of weight. After lunch, I drove to Bridge Park, where the boutiques sit close like bright birds along a wire. I went into the one with clean white walls and long mirrors and the smell of new fabric. Ashley was at the register. She recognized me from the neighborhood and gave a small wave. I asked if she had a minute. She said she was between rushes and leaned on the counter with her hands folded. I told her I was trying to understand something about the Hales, and that I did not need secrets, only general truths. She nodded. She said Gerald comes in every couple of weeks and never asks about sales unless the tag is hidden under a handkerchief. He buys gift items for Diane. He pays with a gold card and signs with a pen he brings from his pocket. She said he is always polite and that he tips the seasonal staff at Christmas. I asked if he returns items. She said rarely. She said Diane returns sometimes and exchanges for something a little nicer. Ashley added that she did not mind telling me this. She said Mr. Lawson people do what they do. I thanked her for the time and bought nothing. I did not need another object to explain what a sentence already did. Back outside, the heat had thickened. I sat on a bench and let the afternoon settle into place. Party with catering, live music, imported wine valet. Regular boutique purchases paid for with ease. My daughter calling me last week to say the pharmacy would not release a refill until a balance was cleared. I thought of the legal pad on my kitchen table, and the left column marked claim and the right column marked cite. I could feel the lines filling in even without the pen. I drove past the Hale Street around 4. The tent was gone, but the grass remembered pressed flat in neat rectangles. Recycling bins stood heavy with glass. A valet sign printed on foam board lay inside the open garage by the potting bench. Diane was not visible, but I heard a vacuum somewhere near the door that leads into the kitchen. Gerald stood at the end of the driveway, with his hand around a mug, talking to a man I did not recognize. I did not stop. I rolled slowly past and turned at the corner and kept going until the street fell behind the trees. At home, I opened the manila folder and added 3 sheets. One for Mrs. Delaney, one for Ashley, one for what my own eyes had counted. I wrote the date under each, and then put the pen down and let my hands rest on the table. The apartment was quiet except for the far-off sound of a lawnmower. I breathed through my nose and let anger float in and out like a cloud. Around 6, my phone vibrated. Emily again, lighter this time. She said she and Daniel were cooking pasta and asked if I wanted to stop by later. I said not tonight and told her to enjoy the evening. We spoke for a minute about the start of the school year and the new principal. She said Daniel might have a second showing on a listing in Worthington and that things were looking up. I told her I hoped so. It is a sentence fathers can say without lying. Hope is stubborn that way. After we hung up, I walked to the window and watched a pair of kids on scooters racing the long shadow of the maple that stands near the curb. They laughed and argued about who won and then laughed again. I boiled water for tea and sat back down with the folder. The right side felt heavier now. Receipt, country club, boutique, party, each a tile that clicked against the next. I imagined how this would sound if I laid it out for Emily. She would say a birthday is a special occasion. She would say a card can belong to a friend. She would say a country club has guest days, a boutique has end-of-season bargains, a rental tent is cheaper than a restaurant if you invite enough people. I could not argue with her heart. I could only argue with the math. I washed the empty mug and set it on the rack beside the others. Then I reached for the small notebook where I keep a list of things that I do not want to trust to memory. I wrote "Call Tom Sanders," and under it I wrote "Ask" about documenting patterns without inflaming anything. I closed the notebook and slid it under the folder. The room sank into that comfortable gray that tells a man to stop adding and rest his eyes. I went to the bookshelf and straightened a frame that did not need straightening. Outside, a car door closed and footsteps crossed the walk and someone laughed. I let the sounds pass through me and then I turned off the kitchen light. I called Tom Sanders on a Tuesday morning and he told me to meet him at his office near Broad Street. He has been my friend since we were both too young to know what we believed. He went to law school and I carried a mailbag. Tom stepped out from a conference room with a file in his hand. He held the door to his office and I took the chair by the window. He asked about Emily just once and then let the question settle while I told him what I had seen since January. I kept my voice even and stuck to dates and places. The country club gatehouse and the gesture of a guard who knew a name without asking. The leather sofa and the pearl necklace. The bottle of wine with the badge I recognized from Bridge Park. The dinner receipt with Gerald's name on it and the line that read, "Champagne and steaks." Tom listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and set the file aside. He told me this had a name. Financial abuse. He said that when money is used to control or siphon or trap, it leaves bruises you cannot photograph. I asked whether Emily was in danger. He said yes. He explained that marriage in Ohio treats much of what you bring home as ours by default. He said, if Emily keeps transferring her paycheck to prop up stories and cover someone else's luxury, a court might still see those dollars as marital and gone. He said if Daniel is adding debt in her name, that debt could ride on her shoulders longer than any apology. He spoke about joint accounts that can be emptied in an hour. I told him I did not want a courtroom. He said that means evidence, receipts, statements, photos with dates that line up, records from pharmacies that show no such balances as claimed, an insurance explanation of benefits that contradicts a sob story. He said, If there are emails or texts that map out the script of emergencies, those are worth more. I asked whether I should confront them. He shook his head. He told me to keep a log with dates and times. He told me to save screenshots with the full header showing timestamps. He said to print what I can and store the originals in a safe place. He explained that if this becomes a case, a judge can issue temporary orders to freeze accounts and require a full accounting, but that only works if we can show a pattern and a risk. Tom asked about accounts in Emily's name. I told him she keeps a checking account where her teacher salary lands like clockwork. He asked whether Daniel has access. I said I did not know for sure. He suggested that Emily open a new account at a different bank and redirect her direct deposit there quietly and with the help of someone she trusts. He said she should pull her credit report and lock it. He said she should change passwords and enable alerts for transactions. I said Emily would call me paranoid if I raised any of that. He said then do not raise it yet. He said what Emily needs first is not strategy, but proof that her story of the world is misplaced. I asked what he needed from me. He said a sworn timeline when the time comes. He said copies of the charges. You can connect to the family that is crying poor. He said witness statements if possible. The waiter, the neighbor. He said all of that would help a judge see the pattern, not just the pain. I asked whether Daniel could be held responsible for what his parents do. Tom said that depends on who planned what. He has seen sons who only carried buckets and never noticed the well. He has seen others who built the well and handed out cups. He suggested we focus on documenting the money first, and the motive will show itself. He asked again about the receipt with the 480 total. I told him I had a photo and the timestamp, and that the name matched the card used. He nodded and asked whether Emily had mentioned the refill balance on that same day. I said she had. He wrote those two facts on a yellow pad and drew a thin line between them. He said there is a concept in our courts called dissipation. When one spouse spends marital assets for a purpose unrelated to the marriage, especially during times of breakdown or in anticipation of separation, the court can credit that back during division. He said, if you can show continued transfers for phantom needs, while luxury spending marches on the scale begins to tip. I told Tom I was not sure how to get more than what I already had. He asked whether Emily still keeps her old laptop at my place sometimes. I said yes, there is a silver one from a few years ago that she forgets when she stays over. He said sometimes old devices keep drafts of emails or automatic downloads of attachments. He did not tell me to search it. He asked whether Emily had ever asked me to help update it. I said she had asked twice and I had put it off. He suggested that the next time she left it, I should do the dutiful father thing and update the software and see if anything obvious needed organizing. He said, do not break any locks. Do not guess passwords. We stood, and he walked me to the door. He put a hand on my shoulder. He said, Emily does not need a hero who wins arguments. She needs a witness who will not look away. Hold the line, gather the facts, and come back when the folder feels heavy in your hand. Outside, the sun slid behind a cloud, and the bricks of the old buildings went a shade darker. I stood on the sidewalk and watched a bus at the curb. I imagined a future where I was wrong, and all of this was a bad dream, and then I pictured the pearls, the leather sofa, the club gate, the stacked wine boxes, the receipt. On the way home, I stopped at the bank and asked to speak with a manager. I told her I wanted to set alerts on my savings account for any withdrawal over a small amount. I asked about creating a new checking account that would hold nothing but what I moved into it for bills. She set it up while I sat there. She handed me a brochure about fraud prevention. Back home, I set the new account paperwork in the desk and opened the manila folder. I added a sheet at the front with 2 words at the top. Working timeline. I listed the dinner, the refill call, the birthday party, the boutique pattern, the country club entrance. I called Emily and asked whether she wanted to stop by Friday night. She said she might, depending on a faculty meeting that sometimes runs long. I told her to bring the old laptop if she remembered. She laughed and said I always turn into tech support when the seasons change. I told her this time I was serious. She said she would try. The apartment went quiet. I brewed coffee and took it black and stood at the window watching clouds migrate over the roofs. I sipped the coffee and felt the tremor in my hand calm itself. Then I set the cup down and began to make a list of what I would need to find and where it might hide. Emily came by on a Saturday afternoon with a canvas tote and the old silver laptop I had asked her to bring. She said it had been acting slow and that the spinning wheel made her want to throw it. She laughed and said if I could make it behave, she would owe me dinner. Daniel was out showing a ranch in Worthington, and she had an hour before meeting a friend for coffee. I made tea and set the laptop on the kitchen table and promised to be quick. She signed in and opened the lid, and the screen blinked awake with a clutter. Desktop folders, the school district logo in the corner, a mail program bouncing with new messages. She pushed the chair back and went to look at the plants on the windowsill. I told her I would run updates. She kissed my cheek and said she would grab a scone from the bakery and be right back. Then she slipped her coat on and let the door fall shut behind her. I ran the system update and watched the progress crawl. When it finished, the machine looked calmer. I opened the mail program to be sure nothing broke. A new message sat at the top of the list. The sender line read, Diane Hale, and the subject carried the tone of a grocery list. I did not open it. The message below it had a small paperclip, and the preview showed the word spreadsheet. The date was that morning. Another message sat a few lines down. Same sender. 2 weeks earlier. The preview showed a number and a word that always makes my stomach stiffen. Copay. I remembered Tom telling me that evidence is not what you imagine, but what is in front of you. I clicked the most recent one and told myself to breathe. The message unfolded into a tidy paragraph of thanks and a short prompt to look at the attachment. At the bottom it said, please confirm transfers by Friday. The attachment opened to an Excel file with multiple tabs along the bottom named by month. The current tab was October. The columns were labeled in plain words. Item, amount, reason, status, sender, notes. The first line read, pharmacy balance and a number that was not small. The reason column said, refill hold. The status column said, pending Emily. The next line read, car maintenance and a number that would require real repairs. The reason column said, urgent. The status column said, Friday. The sender column said, Emily initials. The notes column said, talk to her by Wednesday if no confirmation. The third line read, Dr. Bill and a tidy amount. Reason specialist, status pending. Sender Daniel initials. Notes ask for half now. I clicked the September tab. The pattern ran. Rent shortfall. Copay unresolved. Transmission deposit. Each with a number and a status and a sender. In the right column, small lines. Emily handled. Follow up with Emily. Confirmed by Emily. I scrolled to July. A line for medicine balance due sat on the date of the receipt Michael had sent me from the Italian restaurant. A line for celebration gift sat 2 days before the birthday party Mrs. Delaney had described. The amounts matched. I rested my palms on the table and looked out at the maple. I scrolled to a section of notes at the bottom. short lines with initials: D for Diane, G for Gerald, E for Emily. One note read, "Remind before weekend if necessary." Another read, "Daniel to explain work slump." A third read, "Understands family first." I closed my eyes and saw the leather sofa, the pearls, the club gate, the waiter leaning in and letting the words, "Be careful," slip into my bone. I opened my eyes and went back to the October tab. In the sender column, I saw 3 entries with my daughter's initials. One had been marked confirmed. I clicked the tiny triangle to show the cell history. The timestamp showed 2 days ago. The name associated with the edit matched Emily's school email. I did not forward anything. I did not move a file. I reached into my pocket for my phone and took a photo of the screen, then another as I scrolled. I made sure the date and the sender lines were visible. I stepped through July and took the line where medicine balance due matched the steak and champagne night. I took a shot of the bottom notes with the initials. I moved back to October and captured the prompt to confirm transfers by Friday. The apartment door opened and closed, and Emily called from the hall that the line at the bakery was longer than the bridge. I minimized the windows and clicked the lock screen. She came into the kitchen with a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon and asked how it was going. I said the update ran fine and that the machine should feel snappier. She smiled and set a scone on a plate and pushed it toward me. I pushed it back and said she should take it for the road. She said she had time to sit, and we ate in silence. She talked about the start of the school year and a student who collected bottle caps and lined them in perfect rows. She laughed and told me one of her kids had called her mom by mistake. I asked how Daniel was, and she said he was working every angle and that a colonial in Worthington looked promising. She asked whether I was getting enough sleep. I said I was trying. She said she worried about me sometimes. I told her that was a fair exchange. When she left, I stood for a long moment with my hand on the back of the chair. Then I opened the laptop again and clicked the mail app and scrolled to the older message with the attachment. The September file told the same story in a different month. Columns with amounts and reasons, and the same quiet insistence that money move on a schedule. I took a few more photos and then closed it all and signed out. I set the laptop in its tote and placed it by the door. At the desk, I opened the manila folder and slid new printed photos into plastic sleeves. I wrote the date and the subject on small sticky notes and stuck them to the corners. I turned to the legal pad and added 3 entries to the right-hand column. October file with sender and timestamp. July line matching dinner receipt and medicine claim. Notes section with initials and prompts to collect from Emily. I sat and let them go a few rounds. Love said she is your child. Clarity said these numbers are a machine. Love said people learn after they fall. Clarity said sometimes falling breaks what you cannot fix. I thought of Tom. I took the phone and looked at the photos. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It had a name and a calendar and initials that matched Emily's school email. Outside, a bus braked at the corner, and a woman laughed into her phone. I stood and poured a glass of water and drank it cool and slow. Then I wrote one more line on the pad. Do not confront today. Plan the conversation. Bring the facts with gentleness. Remember, she is my daughter. I closed the folder and slid it into the drawer. The laptop waited by the door. I went to the window. The day had turned a corner. I rested my palm against the cool glass and told myself that the next step had to be careful. I called Emily and asked if she could stop by after school. She said she would swing over before heading home. I set water to boil, then took the manila folder from the drawer and set it on the table with a small neatness that felt like armor. When she knocked, I felt the old reflex to smile first and worry later. I opened the door, and she stepped in with the tired brightness teachers wear in October. I said it should be, then asked if we could sit for a minute. She glanced toward the table and saw the folder. The careful light in her eyes flickered. She sat anyway and wrapped both hands around the mug I placed in front of her. I told her I needed to ask a question and that I would rather ask it badly than keep swallowing it. I asked whether she had taken money of mine to give to Daniel's parents. She lifted her eyes to mine. She said she had moved small amounts when things were tight. She said I had told her years ago that she could use my online bill pay if I ever needed help, and that the password had not changed. She said she just wanted to help. I felt something settle behind my ribs, a cold certainty that did not bring relief. I asked how many times. She named months I recognized from the margins of my notepad. I asked whether Daniel knew the money came from me. She said she had told him she could cover a gap from her savings. I slid the folder toward me and opened it with a care that made my hands look older than they are. I placed 3 printed photos on the table. The dinner receipt with Gerald's name, the wine shop price tag, the spreadsheet with the October tab, and the note that read, "Please confirm transfers by Friday." Emily drew in a breath that sounded like a small cut. I told her what I had seen with my own eyes. The country club gate where the guard waved Gerald through, the leather sofa, the pearls, the birthday party with a tent in the yard, and a valet at the curb. The dinner with champagne and prime rib the night before the pharmacy would not release a refill. I kept my voice even. She said Diane had told her the spreadsheet was just a way to keep track of obligations, that it was temporary, that the numbers moved, because life moved. She said she believed her. She said she had been trying to be a good wife and a good daughter at the same time, and that the world had not given her a map for that. I asked whether she believed my eyes. She looked at the photos again, and a tear broke loose and tracked fast down her cheek. She said she believed that I believed what I saw. I told her belief is not weather. It does not change when a cloud passes. I asked her to look at the line for July and then think about the dinner I showed her and the party the neighbor described. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, a small surrender that did not carry victory for either of us. She reached for my hand across the table and then stopped halfway, her fingers curling as if the reach itself cost too much. She said she had taken 2 transfers from my account this summer when the stories about medicine sounded urgent. She said she knew I would help if she asked, and for once she could not stand to ask. She said she was ashamed. The word came out barely voiced, and it landed between the photos like another piece of evidence. I told her I loved her, and that love had nothing to do with whether a story was true. I said the numbers did not care about our intent. They would keep walking until someone blocked the door. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and said Daniel had promised that a closing was around the corner, and that when it came he would clear all of it. She said she needed to believe that. I said I understood wanting a thing to hold together. I told her I had watched a marriage fray when a sickness came and took more than we knew how to give. I said there are breaks that come from weather, and there are breaks made by hands. One you forgive, one you name. She stood and paced to the sink and back, then sat and looked straight at me. She said she was afraid that if she stopped helping, Daniel would see her as disloyal. She said Diane has a way of making need sound like a test, and that failing the test means you do not belong. I let silence make a little room between us so her words could cool. Then I told her what Tom had told me in a quieter office. I said, Ohio calls it financial abuse when money becomes a leash. I said debts can stick to names longer than apologies. I said if she kept feeding this machine, she could find herself on the wrong side of a door with nothing left to sell. She closed her eyes and nodded. I told her we could take steps that would not blow the house down. Open a new account for her paycheck. Pull a credit report. Set alerts. Move slow and quiet. I told her she did not have to explain it yet. She only had to decide whether the next dollar would go where a spreadsheet told it to go, or where her future asked her to put it. She cried then, not loud, but with the kind of grief that finds the deep places. She said she had taken my money and that there was no excuse. She said she had believed she could fix it later. She said later keeps moving. I reached for her then, and this time she let me hold her. When she pulled back, she asked whether I hated Daniel. I said I wanted him to stop lying, like needed medicine. I said I wanted him to choose his wife over a performance. She asked what I would do next. I said I would keep gathering. I said I would not speak to Daniel until she had a chance to decide what she wanted to defend. She sat very still, and then she said she did not know if she was ready to choose. She wiped her face and stood and put on her coat. She said she was sorry again, and I said I believed her. She asked if she could come by in a few days. I said always. At the door she paused and looked back at the photos on the table. She said, "Please give me a little time." I said I would give her time, and I would not give away the facts. She nodded once and stepped into the hallway. I stood in the middle of the room and let the quiet settle. The folder lay open, the photos a neat geometry that did not blink. I gathered them, slid them back into their sleeves, and closed the cover. Then I sat again and folded my hands. November arrived. I called Daniel and said I wanted to stop by on Sunday afternoon. He sounded wary for a second, then said they would be home. I set the folder on the passenger seat and drove to Dublin. Emily opened the door before I knocked. Diane wiped her hands on a towel and said she was just finishing cookies. We settled into the living room. The television was muted. I placed the folder on my knees and rested my hands on it. I said I had come to lay a few things out so we could all look at them at once. Diane said of course and reached for a cookie. I set down the photo Michael had sent, the check with Gerald's name, and the line items that read champagne and prime ribeye, and a total that could pay for a month of groceries in 3 households. I set beside it a print of the wine shop tag that marked a bottle at $149 before tax. I slid forward a copy of the country club gate photo, where a guard lifted his hand in greeting. I added my written timeline short lines with dates and places that fit together without my help. Gerald said that card could be a friend's card. He said a name on a slip means nothing in a town where people share favors. He said I should be careful about drawing conclusions from so little. Diane widened her eyes and said she did not even like champagne. She added that sometimes people buy wine for anniversaries, and that a picture of a price tag is not proof of anything besides a fancy store with a rude clerk. Daniel said nothing. I said there was more. I placed on the table the photos of the spreadsheet Diane had emailed to Emily. The note at the bottom that read, "Please confirm transfers by Friday." The July tab where a medicine balance sat on the date that matched the dinner. Emily said softly that budgets are messy and that Diane is organized. She said the file helps keep track of obligations. Diane said she was terribly embarrassed that private family paperwork had wandered into a public trial. I read the line from July out loud, the one that said medicine balance due, and then I read the date again. I said that on the same date Gerald's name closed a check for champagne and steaks. I said that 2 days later a tent filled the yard and a band played until late. I read the note that said, "E understands family first." Emily spoke in a rush then. She said she had only tried to help. She said Daniel had told her things would even out. She said Diane had sounded desperate on the phone. She said she moved money because she thought it would be temporary. Gerald said all families have seasons. He said my suspicion hurt him more than the bills ever could. He said he had respected me as a father and a widower, and that this felt like a betrayal of basic trust. Diane began to cry properly, shoulders lifting. She said she could not believe she was being cross-examined in her own home. She said she had never asked Emily to do anything that did not come from love. Daniel leaned forward finally and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at the folder and then at me. He asked how much I thought I had lost. He said it without bite, just the bone of a sentence. He asked whether I had added it up. He asked whether a number would make me feel better. I felt heat rise from my chest into my face and then pass through like a fast fever. I told him I was not here to do math with a man who could not tell the truth about a bill. I told him I was here to stop a machine from running my daughter down. He held my gaze and smiled a small curve that did not touch his eyes. He asked again how much. He said that in his world everything is a ledger, and the sooner a man learns that, the sooner he stops pretending he is special. Emily whispered his name, a warning more than a plea. He lifted a palm as if to calm a skittish animal and told her it was fine. He said we were all grown and should speak plainly. He said marriage is a partnership, and that if I had concerns about the distribution of weight, I should have brought them sooner. He said I had no right to rifle through emails. He said that was a crime of its own. I turned to Emily and read her email address line aloud from the printout. I read the timestamps. I read the request to confirm transfers by Friday. I read the initials beside the cells where she had written confirmed. My voice did not break. Emily sat very still, and in the space after the reading, she did not defend herself. Gerald said this was a circus. He said any judge would throw it out. He said the real story is a man who cannot accept that his daughter has a new family and new loyalties. Diane sniffed hard and said I was tearing a good home apart. She said stress does strange things to memory and to men. She said it with a kindness that made my teeth ache. I felt something old in me stand up. I did not ask it to. It rose by itself, the part of a father that remembers first steps and hospital bracelets and the smell of a head bent under his chin. It rose and it gave me a voice I had not used in years. I heard myself say that I had given my daughter everything I knew how to give, and I would not watch a room full of adults turn that into a seam to pull. I heard myself say that a man who counts family in units of leverage does not get to lecture me about partnership. I heard myself say, I had given you everything, and this is how you pay me back. Silence fell. The television flickered without sound. Outside, a leaf blower coughed to life and then died. Daniel leaned back and crossed his arms and looked past me at the window. Gerald stared at the ceiling. Diane pressed her tissue flat on her knee. Emily finally spoke. She said she needed air. She stood and walked toward the kitchen, then stopped and turned back. She said she had not understood the pattern until she saw it on the table. She said she would not confirm another transfer. She said she needed time to think. Daniel told her to sit down. She did not. She looked at me and there was something in her face that had been missing for months. She was afraid. She was also awake. I gathered the papers slowly and slid them back into the folder. No one tried to stop me. I stood and thanked them for the coffee. Gerald said nothing. Diane made a sound that might have been a word or a sigh. Daniel told me to let myself out. I walked to the front door with the folder under my arm and felt the odd relief that comes when a wall finally names itself a wall. I stepped onto the porch, pulled the door closed behind me, and stood for a moment in the thin November light, while the wind moved through the bare branches like a hand through dry hair. Then I walked to my car and put the folder on the passenger seat and sat with the engine off until the clock on the dash ticked to the top of the hour. Tom and I met twice in the first week, once at his office, once at my kitchen table where he spread forms out like a map. He drafted a complaint that set the facts down without heat. He attached my timeline, the photos of the country club gate, the dinner receipt with Gerald's name, the wine shop tag, the spreadsheet screenshots with dates and initials. He added sworn statements from Mrs. Delaney and Ashley. He wrote a short affidavit for Michael. Tom filed both cases in Cleveland, where the docket moved faster and where a family judge had a reputation for straight lines. A temporary order landed within days, joint accounts frozen, no new debt, without written consent, no transferring of assets to family members, no selling or hiding property. Daniel called Emily and said the court had overreached. Tom told her the court had done its job and to let the order do the talking. Emily moved into a one-bedroom near her school. I stocked her fridge, changed the light bulb over her sink, and left a spare key under the mat. We passed through security and sat. Judge Reynolds entered with steady posture and a voice that did not need to climb. She asked Tom to lay out the case, and he did the photos, the receipt, the gatehouse wave, the birthday tent, the boutique pattern, the spreadsheet tabs. Gerald's attorney argued that the dinner receipt meant nothing, that a name on a slip proves only that people dine with friends. He said the club wave could be a guest day. He said a party does not equal wealth. He said the spreadsheet was a household tool, not a shakedown. Tom called Mrs. Delaney. She described the trucks, the tent, the band. Ashley followed and explained how Gerald shopped, what cards he used, how he declined sales help. Finally, Tom introduced Michael's affidavit, and the judge read it in silence. She asked whether the check matched the date of the medicine balance on the spreadsheet. Tom said it did and gave her the page. She studied it. When it was their turn, Daniel said that marriage requires generosity, and that he and Emily had agreed to help his parents during a difficult year. He said it is not wrong to host a birthday while struggling. He said everyone makes choices, and choosing joy is not a crime. Gerald said that any suggestion of deceit was insulting. He said he had always paid his own way, and that any support from the kids was modest and temporary. He said the spreadsheet was a tool for clarity. Diane cried and said she had never once thought of money as a weapon. The judge asked Emily whether she had moved money from my accounts without permission. Emily did not look at me. She said she had transferred funds twice in the summer when she believed there were medical emergencies. She added that she later learned the funds supported other expenses she would not have approved. The judge asked if she confirmed entries on the spreadsheet. Emily answered yes. The judge asked if she did so under pressure. Emily said the pressure came from herself and from a belief that love is measured in dollars. The judge wrote a note and thanked her. Judge Reynolds said money in a marriage is not a test of loyalty. She said the evidence showed a pattern of requests paired with luxury spending that could not be explained as coincidence. She ordered restitution of $45,000 to be paid back to the marital estate funds to be split according to the final dissolution. She said Daniel would lose access to joint accounts immediately, and that any attempt to circumvent the freeze would bring sanctions. She said the Hales would provide a full accounting of transfers and gifts over the last 2 years within 30 days. Emily exhaled. Daniel looked toward the exit door. Soon after, Gerald received a letter from the country club suspending and then revoking his membership. Diane found the front pew at church taken and invitations ceased. Daniel received a letter from the Ohio Division of Real Estate referencing complaints and a review of conduct. His license was put on hold, and then suspended. He later surrendered it. Bills mounted. The Hales missed payments, moved dates, then stopped answering. A lien appeared, then another. A for sale sign went up and came down. Bankruptcy followed. Emily lived through those months underweight. She kept teaching, wrote careful notes to parents, corrected spelling in red pen. At night, she sat on the edge of her rented bed. She began seeing a counselor, told her she could not tell where guilt ended and grief began. We met Tom once more to finalize the remaining pieces. The restitution order moved through accounts into escrow. The dissolution moved forward with less fighting than I expected. Tom shook my hand and told me to sleep. The day Daniel carried 2 boxes from the apartment Emily had left, I happened to be there replacing a blind. He set the boxes by the curb and called someone I did not see. Emily watched from the stairs with her hand on the railing. When the car drove away, she turned inside without a sound. I cooked stew and we ate at my table. Emily said she felt humiliated and angry. She asked whether I felt vindicated. I told her victory and sorrow share the same chair. I said I was glad the bleeding had stopped. I said I was sorry it had been her blood that showed us the cut. On a Sunday in late February, we drove by the Hale house. The wreath was gone. 2 windows were dark at noon. A realtor's sign bore a new agent's name. Emily said it looked smaller. I said most stages do when the lights are off. Back at her place, she folded laundry, told me she had closed the last joint card, and set up direct deposit. She said she had set transaction alerts and had told her counselor she was done buying tests she could never pass. I poured tea and we sat in quiet that did not hurt. That night, I opened the folder and read the early notes. I put the folder away and stood a long time at the window. I pressed my palm against the glass and told myself the next part would not be easier, only clearer. I brewed coffee and stood at the sink while steam fogged the small kitchen window. I took the framed photo of my wife from the bookshelf and set it on the table. I told her I had kept my promise to be careful. I told her the hard part had happened and we were still standing. A light knock broke the quiet. Emily let herself in with the key I had pressed into her palm weeks earlier. She said, "Dad, I was wrong. I was blind because I wanted love to pay for everything it could not provide." I pulled out a chair and she sat. I poured coffee and she wrapped both hands around the mug. She said she had spoken with her counselor and with Tom and with herself in the bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. She said she had started making 2 lists each night. What is true? What I wish were true. She looked at the photo of her mother and said she missed her voice most when apologies are needed. I told her money can be replaced. Trust takes longer. But I am still your father. The sentence stood in the room like a new beam. It did not bend. She cried then. She said she felt foolish. She said she kept replaying small moments. She said she had ignored the sound of her own instincts because the cost of listening felt too high. She said she had begun to sleep again. We spoke about simple things, her students and the way a boy named Martin had started reading aloud. The new principal who walked the halls with a clipboard and remembered names. She said she had set transaction alerts that ping her phone, and that when the ping comes, she asks herself if the purchase belongs to the person she wants to be in a year. I told her that guardrails do not keep you from living. They keep you on the road long enough to get somewhere worth arriving. I said she was old enough to write her own notes now. She said she would. We did not say Daniel much. When we did, it was the quiet use of a name that no longer needed adjectives. She said the building felt less heavy now that he had moved out. She said she no longer jumped when a text arrived. I told her about walking past the club and watching the guard not lift his hand. I said accountability. She nodded. I told her I had put the folder away and did not intend to carry it from room to room anymore. She said she was grateful I had carried it long enough to cross a bridge she could not see. We ate toast with jam and let a small silence stretch across the table. She reached for the photo of her mother and traced the frame with her finger. She said she remembered the way her mother would place a palm between her shoulder blades before she spoke hard truth. She said she could feel that hand on her back today. After breakfast, we took a short walk. The sidewalks were dry, and the air bit just enough to remind you to keep moving. We passed a couple carrying a plant wrapped in brown paper, and a kid in a puffy coat dragging a sled along bare concrete. Emily linked her arm through mine. Back inside, she asked if I still talked to Mom out loud. I said I do. I said it helps me keep my voice true when no one else is in the room. She said she had started writing letters she would never mail. She said the act makes apologies real and keeps them from curdling into performance. She said she writes one to herself each Sunday and tears it up after she reads it once. She pulled a small envelope from her coat and slid it across the table. Inside was a bank cashier's check and a note that said for the 2 summer transfers and for the pieces of trust I cannot repay today. I told her the check would go into a fund with her name on it. I told her the note was worth more than the paper that held it. She asked me to keep the note for a while, in case the words tried to drift. I set it in the drawer beside the corkscrew and the tape measure and the flashlight. We stood, and I held her and felt the stubborn work of forgiveness begin beneath my ribs. She held on and then let go and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said she needed to get to the store before the dinner rush. Before she left, she placed her palm on the photo of her mother and whispered something I did not hear. Then she kissed my cheek and stepped into the hall. The door closed, and the apartment returned to its light. I washed the 2 mugs and set them in the rack to dry. I returned the photo to the bookshelf and straightened the stack of mail I now allowed to rest unopened until afternoon. I walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard and the blue that had moved a shade closer to evening. I thought about the past year and the way justice had arrived in practical clothes. It did not come to strike poses. It came to write orders and make phone calls and teach a daughter to change her passwords. It came to remove a membership from one man and a sales license from another and a necklace from a throat that had learned to tremble on cue. It also came to a small apartment with a mattress on the floor and a woman who could finally sleep. Justice is not one thing. It is a series of doors closing and others opening, some quiet, some loud, all necessary. I thought about kindness and the trouble it gets into when it goes out alone. Kindness without wisdom is a man who leaves his front door wide and wonders where his furniture went. Wisdom without kindness, though, is a locked room that smells of fear. The work I have learned is the marriage of the 2. You keep your hand open and your eyes open. You give without feeding a machine. You love without letting someone count your love in dollars. Love cannot be blind and still call itself love. Blindness is only easier in the beginning. I sat and wrote 3 sentences on a card and taped it inside the cabinet where I keep the coffee. The first said, "Protect what you build." The second said, "Ask for receipts from the stories you are told." The third said, "Choose courage over comfort when the choice matters." Simple lines. Enough for a morning when the brain has not woken all the way. I turned on the lamp my wife found at a yard sale, the one with the shade that turns light warm. I felt the room settle around a future that would not be easier, only clearer, and that is enough for a man who wants to cross the rest of his years with his head up. If this story gave you something worth keeping, share it with someone who might need the same light. If you are here like this video, subscribe for more true stories and tell me what you take from this journey and where you are watching from.